Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with baked apple roses. That's right, we've all been there before. You bite into an apple and you think to yourself, this is good, but I wish it was like 75% pastry and shaped like a rose. Well, I think we've come up with something perfect for that exact situation. And the good news is it's way easier than it looks, because you do have to admit it looks pretty complicated. But as you're about to see, it's actually quite simple. So let's go ahead and get started. And first up, we're going to need to slice and soften some apple. So I'm going to take a red apple. Anything that would work in an apple pie is going to work here. And I'm going to cut it in half, and then we'll trim off the end. And using a very sharp knife, we'll make some beautifully even thin slices. All right, that one was a little thick. That's better. So as you can see here, we want these nice and thin. And by the way, we're definitely leaving the skin on. As you'll see, that adds a very important visual element later. So we'll slice our halved apple nice and thin. And I guess we could have cored the apple before we started slicing, but I actually prefer to do it afterward. So I'm just removing the bare minimum. And I just like using one of these little round pastry cutters. And by the way, from what I've heard, as long as you remove the seeds, you can eat everything else. So this could be unnecessary, but I did it anyway. And then once our apples are sliced and possibly cored, we're going to transfer those onto a plate because these apples have to be softened a little bit before we start rolling the pastry, otherwise they'll break. So we'll throw those on a plate, and it's okay if they overlap a little bit. And then all we need to do is microwave these for about 45 seconds or so, or until they just go limp. And by the way, if you don't have a microwave, I will give you some alternatives on the blog post. So to test, give them a little wiggle, and if they kind of flap around a little bit like that, they're done. Okay, we don't want mushy. Like I said, we just want to be able to work with these without them breaking. So to hedge my bets, what I like to do is put over a piece of plastic, and then a towel to kind of keep that heat in there, and I'll just let those sit, continuing to soften a little bit, while I move on to prep the pastry. So what we want to use for this ideally is a couple pieces of puff pastry, which is sort of what I have here. Truth be told, this is actually some trimmings from a very exciting experiment I just did, where I tried to create a puff pastry using biscuit dough. So stay tuned for that at some point in the future. But for the sake of this video, we're going to pretend it's puff pastry. And on a floured surface, what we need to do is somehow, some way, roll this out nice and thin into something roughly, 3 inches or so by maybe 12 to 15 inches. And the final thickness should probably be just under 1/8 of an inch. So I tried to get it as close as I could with a rolling pin before switching to the trusty old pizza cutter for the final trimming. And you've probably figured out I'm just making 2 here, but this is not a recipe, it's a technique. So depending on how much pastry and apples you have around, you can scale this up to as many as you want. And then once our pastry has been rolled and trimmed to the appropriate size, we're going to take a little bit of melted butter and spread it all over the surface. And yes, we usually do use a pastry brush for this, but I felt like spooning, which works just as good, and easier to clean, by the way. And then once our dough has been buttered, we're going to sprinkle on a very generous application of cinnamon sugar, which of course is just sugar that has cinnamon stirred into it. And of course, you could sprinkle the cinnamon and the sugar separately, but this method will ensure complete and perfect distribution. And then once that's mixed up, we will sprinkle that over our butter. And by the way, how much you put on is totally up to you. Okay, I went fairly light here, because as you know, I'm very health conscious. But if you want something a little stickier, a little sweeter, a little more decadent, you could easily put down twice as much as you see me doing here. I mean, you guys are the Jeremiah Towers of your baked apples shaped like flowers. So that's totally up to you. And at this point, we can go ahead and start laying down our apple slices. So we'll start placing those down along the edge. And by the way, you want to start probably about 1 inch in from the end so that we have a little bit of plain dough left when we finish our rolling. So we'll place those down, overlapping partially as you can see. And what we want is for the top of the apple to extend about 1/8 or 1/4 inch past the edge of the dough. But of course, having said that, a little variance is fine. If some are a little higher, some are a little lower, that's all going to add to what we hope is a very realistic look. And then once our apples are in position, we'll simply fold the bottom half of the dough up over, just like this. Then we'll kind of press down and seal the ends. And you should end up with something resembling this. And then what we want to do next is paint the surface of the dough with a little bit of egg wash, which is nothing more than an egg beaten with a couple teaspoons of water, and we'll brush that on, after which we will do one more application of our cinnamon sugar, and again, totally up to you with how heavy-handed to be, and at that point we are finally ready to roll. So we'll start at one end and roll it up towards the other, keeping it as even as possible. And of course that pastry is going to expand a little when it cooks, so do not roll this super tight, just roll it up like this, and you should end up with something that looks very similar to a rose. Check it out. And then we'll want to take that little extra piece of dough and kind of stretch it around like this to keep everything together. So like I said, a fairly simple procedure. So I'll go ahead and I'll roll up my second rose the exact same way. And apparently this one had a little less dough or less apples because it did come out a little smaller. But that didn't bother me. I'm Chef John, not Chef Robot. So you have to expect some variations. And then once our roses are rolled, we're going to transfer those into some buttered and sugared ramekins. So just brush a couple appropriately sized ramekins with butter, and then dust them with some white sugar, shaking out any excess. And then, like I said, we will transfer the roses into the ramekins. And yes, by the way, you can use muffin tins for this, although the cooking times might vary, but we'll talk about that on the blog as well. And then once those are placed in, last but not least, one last little dusting on top with the cinnamon sugar, at which point these are ready for the oven. So let's go ahead and transfer those into the center of a 400-degree oven for about 45 minutes. And we're going to want to place these right on the rack, so be careful. Okay, the bottoms aren't going to cook as well as if you put them on a pan. So we'll place them just like that, and we will bake those for about 45 minutes or until well browned and looking absolutely gorgeous, which I'll show you in a second. But first, one tip, when you take these out of the oven, play it safe and use some tongs with a pan underneath in case they slip. But anyway, like I said, we're going to cook those about 45 minutes or until they look like this. And then what we want to do is let these cool for about 5 or 10 minutes in the ramekin before unmolding these while they're still warm. And in case you're interested, while they are still warm, you could take your tongs and kind of pull up and or move around those apple slice rose petals to make them look even more perfect. But anyway, like I said, we'll let those sit for about 5 or 10 minutes before removing them from the ramekin. And if necessary, you could just use a paring knife to loosen it up. But as long as these are still pretty hot, they should come out relatively easy, which mine did. And as you can see, that pastry got nice and golden brown. So if yours don't look like that when you unmold them, put them back in. And at this point, all we have to do is let them cool. So I did transfer mine onto a rack to cool completely. And once that happened, I was ready for the official final touch, a little dusting of powdered sugar, which, as you know, I don't like. I'm really not a fan of the powdered sugar. But the consultants tell me that if I use it, I have a 45% better chance of someone sharing this on Pinterest. So sometimes you got to do what you got to do. So a little powdered sugar, and at that point, those baked apple roses are done. And just looking absolutely beautiful. And I'll admit, even if these tasted terrible, I would still make them because they just look so amazing. But I'm happy to report they don't taste terrible. They taste incredible and sound incredible. All right, that crispy, flaky pastry surrounding those sweet, perfectly cooked apples. This is like an entire handful of the best parts of an apple pie. So I just love everything about these. In fact, the only real problem I have with this is what to actually call it, since it's a little hard to categorize. I mean, when people hear apple rose, they think of an apple carved into a rose. But what other name would work? It's not a tart, it's not a turnover, it's not a Danish, although it's kind of rolled up like one, but not a Danish. So that's the only minor issue here. But you know what? It really is much to do about nothing. Because to paraphrase the late great William Shakespeare, an apple rose by any other name would taste and look as sweet. So I really do hope you give this a try. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.